speaker today, our former US President, Al Gore, Vice President, or almost President. I wanted to make him a president.
President for most of us.
He didn't agree. Okay, that didn't work.
You just reawakened my PTSD.
And also a very good friend. We have worked together for almost 20 years on climate issues. But more, we all know Al Gore was elected to the US House of Representatives and to the Senate and was the 45th Vice President in 1993 for 8 years. But equally well known he is for an outstanding film, The Inconvenient Truth. And I think that was, for as climate scientists for a changing world, a spokesperson that really showed what is changing. And I also like to call Al one of my best grad students, even though you're not in my classes, but you never stop asking questions. And this is good because you want to know the truth. The truth, why do we have change? Why does it change? And I really look forward, because I'm aware by the end of the week you will be in Sundance Film Festival. There is a second film coming out. I don't reveal the title yet, or I don't know it actually, but I'm quite sure it's building on the momentum of The Inconvenient Truth. Welcome, Al, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Connie. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Christiana Figueres, magnificent leadership in Paris and continuing in a new role. Minister Catherine McKenna, I don't know if she's here. Well, I don't know. I came in a little bit late, and I apologize for being late. But ministers, state secretaries, distinguished guests, all
protocol observed.
All protocol observed. I used to be in politics, so I try to do this. But I also want to acknowledge those who are watching by means of the video link in the other rooms, and to the other hosts of this, thank you so much. Thank you for calling me one of your best grad students. I regret I've never gotten that degree, but I began as an undergraduate under a great scientist named Roger Revelle, who unexpectedly, to me, opened my eyes at a young age to this crisis in the 1960s. He was the first scientist to organize the experiment to measure CO2 in the atmosphere. Many in this audience know more about that than I do. But Dave Keeling then began those measurements. His son is continuing to do so. But he also described the climate system as a complex system that redistributes heat from the tropics to the poles through a variety of heat energy transfer mechanisms, ocean currents, wind currents, multi-year El Nino type phenomena, and the rest. And the role of the Arctic in its response to man-made global warming is disrupting the long-time equilibrium pattern of that complex system. It settled into roughly its present form in the wake of the last ice age. And I'm not educated enough or smart enough to tell you how long it took when the glaciers retreated to settle into this pattern, maybe a millennium. But that pattern has been conducive to the rise and flourishing of human civilization. It was not long after that new equilibrium pattern that we still mostly enjoy locked into place that agriculture was invented. The first cities were established, and most of what we regard as human civilization developed within this envelope. And now, of course, we are at a crossroads. We really have to make a choice, because the dumping or spewing of 110 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the atmosphere every 24 hours it has built up to the point where we're radically changing the thermodynamic balance within the system. All of these things you know, but let me spell it out the way I think about it to aim it at the importance of the Arctic and what you have organized here, Connie. The water cycle is, as a consequence, being radically disrupted. And the evaporation off the oceans is coming through atmospheric rivers over the land, causing these historic downpours, floods, and mudslides. The pattern of deluge followed by drought has taken hold. Here in Switzerland last year was the least, last month, Switzerland experienced the least snowfall of any December since the record keeping began in Switzerland. And everyone knows these hydrological disruptions and connects them to the larger pattern. And the experts in the cryosphere have done more than most to add to our understanding of what is going on. Water and ice alternate at a threshold point, obviously, and the difference between 0 degree and 1 degree is more than 1 degree. It's the difference between liquid and solid, but there are other thresholds as well. There's an albedo threshold, as is well known, because the albedo of the ice is very different from the albedo of the Arctic Ocean. And of course, Bianca Perrin, who was with us in Greenland, is now in Antarctica, and of course Antarctica is land surrounded by ocean, the Arctic is the ocean surrounded by land. So the change in the albedo, when the threshold is crossed and the ice turns into water, then the albedo radically changes from, 90% reflectivity roughly to 90% roughly absorption. I'm sure the precise numbers are slightly different from that, but that's close enough. Thank you so much. And it's all connected. Roger Revelle, by the way, was a Renaissance man in some respects, and earlier in his career, he did some of the deep ocean trench sampling along the Atlantic Rift that was instrumental, along with many others, in confirming belatedly the theory of continental drift. It's always astonishing to me how many decades after Alfred Wegener made his discovery in Greenland that the established institutions of science still held out, no, it can't be true. And we do tend to, many of us, push away large systemic patterns if they don't fit in with what we have learned earlier in our lives. And I told the story in the movie, thank you for referencing An Inconvenient Truth, but I told the story in that movie of a classmate of mine who pointed out, as countless elementary school students did in looking at a map of the world and noticing the outline of South America and the outline of Africa, and said, did they ever fit together? And the teacher said, of course not. That's the most ridiculous question I've ever heard. And of course they did. And in that same way, the connections within this complex global climate system are, thanks to the work of great scientists like Connie and many of you, are now coming into view. We have often in human history experienced a conflict between our visceral everyday perceptions and the more accurate perceptions that science makes available to us. When Copernicus was on his deathbed, he received the first copy from the printer of The Revolution of the Spheres. And in that historic work, he pointed out, among other things, the contrast between what his calculations showed and what the visceral perception of the relationship between the sun and the earth was. For millennia, people had watched the sun come up in the east and traverse the sky and descend in the west, and so obviously the sun was going around the earth. Actually, in the ancient world, many understood the truth even then, but that perception was wrong. And in exactly that same way, we look up at the sky outside this building, and our visceral perception is that it is a vast and limitless expanse. But in reality, science tells us, and the pictures from the astronauts confirm, it's such a thin shell around, what is it, about 11 kilometers. If you could drive a car at normal speed straight up, you'd get to the top of the sky in a few minutes. And we're treating it as an open sewer. And generations ago, in most advanced countries, people noticed that dumping all of their waste in the stream, whether it was the Thames or the Seine or whatever, if you dumped all the waste in the river or the creek, and as population grew, people said, well, that's not a good thing. Maybe we should stop doing that. But we are now at that point with this atmospheric sewer. We can't continue to use it as a sewer. And the Arctic gives us the most visible means of recognizing the consequences. Connie and I were in Greenland together, and thank you so much for taking me to Swiss camp and teaching me again about so much of this. In April of last year, the temperatures in Greenland spiked for several days at a level that was, if it's not unprecedented, it's certainly extremely unusual. And the glaciers, the tops of the peaks, they just started exploding. It's fantastic to see, and the degradation is beyond anything that I have ever seen in the past. And just last month, for the second year in a row, right in the middle of the long, dark, cold polar winter night, the North Pole started thawing. Second year in a row. And even now, the temperatures have been, 20 degrees Celsius above normal. And the consequences for our civilization are as difficult to grasp for most of us as it is difficult to grasp these complex systems, and as it was hard to grasp continental drift, as it is hard to grasp the connections between the ocean currents and the wind currents and the ice and all the rest. But we see in Syria, perhaps one of the best known examples, the drought from 2006 to 2010 pushed 1.5 million people off the land, destroyed 60% of the farms in Syria, killed 80% of the livestock in Syria. And when those climate refugees were forced into the cities of Syria, WikiLeaks revealed internal deliberations of the Syrian government, not without culpability. Of course, there are many factors that led to the gates of hell opening in Syria, but first among them was what the ministers said to themselves: we can't deal with this. This is going to cause a social explosion, because they were crowding in with another 1.5 million refugees from the Iraq War. And since the farms were no longer producing food, most of them, the crisis got worse. And now the refugees have been streaming into Europe, destabilizing the political equilibrium in Europe, and the UK, and Brexit, and the list goes on, and populist authoritarianism. And all of this is connected, of course. But my point is, if we don't act quickly, it could be just the beginning of hundreds of millions of climate refugees. We're talking about the Arctic, but the climate scientists often remind us that the tropics rule. The Arctic may steer the system, and I'm going to return to that. But when you look at the migration of species, you know, the average land-based animals are moving poleward at the rate of 3 to 4 meters per day. In the tropics, because the areas between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn have a sameness to them, animals and plants that need to migrate in order to seek out the climate conditions they have evolved into, they can't move just a few meters or a few kilometers. They have to move out of that region. And people cannot be compared to what we see in the rest of the natural world, but there are some similarities. And some of the scientific papers have warned us that the tropics and subtropics, some regions, are becoming unlivable, or in danger of becoming unlivable. One day last year in the Persian Gulf region, one city had a combination of heat and humidity, the heat index, of 74 degrees Celsius. People can't live for more than a few hours outdoors in that. So these consequences are quite dramatic. How do we communicate it? Every way we can. And to return to my central point, the Arctic is the most visible manifestation because we can see the ocean opening up, we can see the ice moving rapidly toward the sea and calving. We're waiting on Larsen B right now. Who knows? Larsen B famously, Larsen C famously collapsed in 35 days and confirmed Larsen C some years back, about 12 years ago, and actually confirmed something Connie has been teaching for a long time, that the water pooling on the top of the ice doesn't just refreeze. Its weight is more than that of the ice, and it tunnels downward. And I got another lesson from Connie on the moulins, and I thought I understood them, but I understand them a little bit better now. I'm still working on that degree. But the same thing is now about to happen with Larsen B, and then there'll be A, and then the rest. And we know about the Thwaites Glacier and the Totten Glacier in East Antarctica, which is now being intensively studied. And of course, Greenland. And now correct me if I'm wrong, I'm always in danger of getting out just a little bit ahead of what the real experts will permit me to say. But I generally don't get in too much trouble with them because I go back and see Tom Stocker here and the Antarctic ice record. I'm working on another degree there, which I never will get either. But I think now that the top scenario is probably adjusted upward to 2 meters of sea level rise in this century, the 8.5 scenario. And it's been 1 meter. And of course, there's been an argument between the European ice scientists and the American ice scientists, and I won't try to mediate that. But, well, actually, I will, but if they'll let me. But the levels are going up. Last year, not long before I went with Connie and Bianca to Greenland, I went to the city of Miami during the so-called supermoon, which coincided with a king tide, and I saw fish from the ocean swimming in the streets, and it is now a regular occurrence. And of course, one consequence of the melting in the Arctic, along with the flows that will soon be larger from the Antarctic, is that our coastal species, because most humans live within tens of kilometers of the ocean, is now going to have to make an orderly retreat from some of the lowest lying populated areas. And how much of that area will have to be evacuated along our coast? Well, it partly depends. Unfortunately, we have locked in some regrettable consequences already, but the full range of the catastrophe that could unfold can still almost certainly be avoided. So the Paris Agreement that Christiana was so instrumental in making possible is the best and most hopeful development we have had in the decades-long effort to try to organize a global response to the climate crisis. It's not enough, of course. And I'm sorry I didn't hear your remarks, and I apologize if I'm repeating some of them. We do think a lot alike. But the challenge, I used to be in politics, as I said, and I know from that perspective that from the very beginning of our effort to deal with the climate crisis, the political reality has been this: the maximum that is politically feasible at any given moment has fallen well short of the minimum that the scientific community tells us the laws of physics require. So what is our response to that gap? Despair? That doesn't really do much good. Despair is just another form of denial. The response is to expand the limits of what is possible. And Paris did more to expand the limits of what is possible than any previous effort. The scientific community, Connie and your colleagues, have done the most by making the world aware of what the reality is, even though there are still deniers or denialists, whatever you want to call them, whether they're making money from carbon pollution or whether they're ideologically motivated to try to make sure that there's nothing that expands the role of government in ways that might interfere with business. It's a mix of motivations, but they're losing because the reality is so clear now. Every night on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. The disasters are becoming more intense and more frequent. And people recognize this. Even if they don't give it the same name, they talk to their parents and grandparents and their community leaders, and they understand. We are leaving the part of history in which we developed and heading into an unknown region of history. But we can still shape it, and of course, we must. For a long time now, there have been only three basic questions about the climate crisis. Must we change? Can we change? Will we change? The scientific community, led in many ways because of the visual nature of the Arctic by the Arctic scientists, have long since answered the question, must we change? The IPCC and now social scientists looking at the second and third order consequences are making it very clear, we must change. The business community and the technology developer community have now provided us an answer to the second question, can we change? It is stunning that the cost of electricity from solar energy and wind energy has come down so rapidly and is continuing to do so. Now energy storage is following in turn in all forms of energy efficiency. So yes, we can change. It's now in many regions the cheapest form of energy. So the final question is, will we change? And I'll conclude by echoing what I did hear Christiana talking about. I just came from one of the many meetings of business leaders here at Davos. And the World Economic Forum is a wonderful institution in my view. I've had mixed feelings about it in some years past, but I have come to really admire what it does because the discussions open business and government leaders to points of view and facts that they may seldom encounter in other fora. But one of the large questions that has been debated here at the World Economic Forum is, how can we restore vitality and dynamism to the global economy? How can we push back this wave of unrest and populist authoritarianism fueled by people whose jobs are being lost and wages are stagnating and hopes for the future diminishing? Not to put too dire a face on it, but that's what many people feel, and that's what many people connect to some of the political movements that we have recently seen emerge around the world. Well, there's a lack of what Keynes called animal spirits in the global economy, and one reason is middle-income jobs have been lost and incomes have been stagnating and going down. What if we had a global project that put people to work in every country simultaneously to build for the future, to put money in their pockets so they could spend it in the stores, revitalize the economy in a sustainable way, and lift the prospects for the human future? Where could we find such a global jobs-intensive project? Well, actually, solving the climate crisis is precisely what the economic doctor ordered, because we need to rehabilitate and change buildings in every community and city throughout this world with insulation and better windows and lighting. We need to build the infrastructure for renewable energy. We need to retrofit our civilization in ways that save money and boost profits and put people to work and reduce emissions. We could also instill something else that's greatly needed in our global civilization now, and that is a sense of moral purpose. Because the unrest and the problems that have been growing are partly linked to a feeling by many that we have lost our compass, chasing short-term profits and short-term political gains and short-term cheap cultural exploitation, and have lost the ability to steer in a longer-term way. General George Marshall, at the end of World War II, he became Secretary of State of my country. He once said at the end of that war, "It is time we steered by the stars and not by the lights of each passing ship." And the United States helped to found what became the European Union, established NATO, established the Marshall Fund, and many other institutions, the World Bank and IMF, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is time once again to steer by the stars, to listen to these Arctic scientists, to take the evidence that is so compelling and say, we've got to act, we've got to stop using the atmosphere as a sewer, we've got to save and stabilize the conditions that will continue to give rise to the flourishing of humanity. A famous poet in my country in the last century, Wallace Stevens, said, "After the last no comes a yes, and on that yes the future world depends." I hope we have seen the last no, because it's time for a yes. Thank you.